everyone, if I say there's three properties of color, right? We have value,
Saturation.
and hue. Or
Chroma.
or chroma, we'll call it,
Chroma.
right? So what color is it, how dark is it, and how intense is it versus how gray, okay? Three primary colors, the more that those three are added in equal proportion, that's the grayer the color goes, right? So neutral gray is an even mix of blue and yellow and red, and that's where we're at for the center. So if I'm talking about 60% saturation, I'm going to use basically 0% saturation, right, to get to neutral gray. I'm going to call that 0%. And I'm going to call it 100% if we've got, out of the tube, cleanest possible color, all right? So when I'm talking about in the shadows, keeping your saturation levels to that 60-65% range, what I'm really talking about is if we've got, the color wheel here, and this is neutral gray in the middle, I'm saying we go to about, just a little past halfway out. It's getting obviously brighter as it goes to the outside edge of the color wheel, right? Everybody's familiar with that idea. So don't go past about here with the saturation in your shadows. And the reason for that is because we only have two ways of representing light in a painting. One way is by relative values and the other is by relative saturation. When something goes from light to shadow in your painting and you make it go from darker to lighter, it's going to read like light is falling on that. However, that's not the only thing that's going to happen, right? The other properties of color are going to change too. It's probably going to get a little warmer in most lighting conditions. And also the saturation level is going to go up. So if we don't leave room to boost the saturation level in the lit side, then we're losing some of that impact of light that is possible for us to attain in the painting. And generally, even where the light is hitting something, you don't want that at 100% saturation, right? Because that's where we're looking to see what the actual local color is of the object. Well, most objects are not at 100% saturation. They could be anywhere between 0 to 100, right? So only 1% of the time will they be around that 100%. So if we're keeping our lit area of the object, maybe between 75 and 90, we've got to keep, when that moves into the shadow, in that sort of 50 to 65 kind of range, so that we have room to independently control the saturation level, make sure that goes up as we move the object from shadow to light in the painting.
What's a good percentage of moving up? Say you're starting
Well, trust
with
your observation, but I think you could generally say it's connected. It's another way of showing the light, right?
Yeah.
So that'd be like saying how much do we move up the shadow as it moves into the light, but that is completely dependent on the lighting situation, right?
Sure.
If it's if there's very little ambient light and a really strong spot, you could go up 80% from shadow to light.
Okay.
Or on a day like this, we go outside and move up 10%.
You're talking about now value, not saturation.
Value. But saturation, same thing.
Yeah.
So where we have a lot of ambient light and not a strong light, we're going to have a smaller step up in saturation. So you're going to have to trust your intuition and your observation for those kind of things, right? But stronger light will bring bigger differences.
Think it through. Make sure that you're backing
But
off
typical
your
sunlight,
saturation.
figure 15% or 20%. I don't know. So it's almost hard to quantify those things so abstractly, but it's not almost hard. It's impossible. But anyway, but somewhere in there, the important thing is to leave room for that to happen.
Yeah.
Just as in the highlights, we want to leave room. Just in the lights, we want to leave room for the highlights, right? And not make them at 100% white, because that won't show as much intensity of light for the reason we just talked about, because we have two ways of showing intensity of light in a painting, right? And the other one, saturation in white, has a 0 saturation. Now, I wanted to mention this too, because white is 0 saturation, but it's not gray either, really. So as we add white into something, in the theory, what's happening is that we're maintaining that 100% saturation, right? So I can take this cad lemon, 100% saturation, and if I add white to it, I'm not graying it, I'm not putting any purple in it. So we're still at 100% saturation. What I'm doing is changing the value, right? However, white is still a 0. So as we get closer to white, we put more and more white in there, we are losing some of that pigment density. We're not going grayer, but we're losing saturation in a different way, in a much more subtle way. But by the time we get to the very high end of this, and it's almost all white, now we're really starting to feel that loss of saturation there, and it does feel a little grayer and not as lit up as this one does, right? So white's pretty much good to use up until a certain point, and then you start to get this diminishing return of the effect of light where it's affecting the value, but it's also subtracting from the perception of saturation at the same point, which is why we don't want those white highlights. We want the highlight to have the most possible light in it, right? So we don't want to take our highlight past about here, value-wise, because it won't allow us to put saturation into the paint and let that highlight. Same thing now with saturation. We're going to want to leave room for the local color of the object to not be 100% saturated object, like a reflection, right? We can shine a light on any of the consistently very few people in this room. But we could shine a light on anyone in here and have a fairly high level of intensity, right? It's going to be like pinks and oranges kind of, but there's also some undertones of yellow ochre and some more neutral kind of things in it. So if we want to, if we're painting the shadow value and then we're stepping that up into the light, we want to make sure that, if, even with the strongest light on any of us, we're not going to be more than like a 90% saturation in a flesh tone, right? I mean, it'll start to look ridiculous past that. So, so probably much more typical would be 80 to 85% saturation for a lit flesh tone. So you want to make sure that in the shadows, even when you see the reflected colors, and on Tina's skin or any of that stuff, or on we got Susie coming in tonight, with that very white. Oh, that's right, we have Maud. And she's a little different, but on Susie, we have that very white, or team where you have the very dark, and you see so much color going into those shadows.
Yeah.
You still have to be careful with the saturation level of those colors. You want to see them, you want to paint them. You don't want the saturation levels to be competing with the saturation levels in the lit side of the same object, just as you don't want the values, even if you have a reflected light into that shadow, you don't want the value of that to go up so significantly that it competes with the range of values in the lit side of the same object or local color. Okay?
Pretty tricky. We have Susie coming in a master class next week, I think, just to take notes. I'm pretty sure that's
Master class? I think we have her, I think we have Leona next week and Monday.
Monday. But I think we have Susie next Tuesday.
Do we?
I think so.
All right.
Yeah. It's been booked for like 3 months.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Well, I don't look at that stuff too often, but okay.
I'm just saying. I had 2 master classes booked in the same week, which I couldn't get around. But anyway.
I don't mind.
Yeah.
It would give me a fun, easy week.
Yeah.
So, let's see. So if we're controlling the properties of color independently, how comfortable is everyone with doing that? That's about what I thought. Now, the truth is that you've been doing it all along. Every single one of you here has been doing it. But if I say to do it, it may just be like a mental spin on that. That's a new way of looking at it. But I'd like you to be comfortable with the idea of it. Okay? So let's take the idea of going from green to yellow, since we did that last week, right? And I'll just do this same demo again in case anybody missed it or wants a refresher on this. As we go from local color and then it moves into light, it's going to get lighter, right? So the rookie might add white into that, and that'll work. That'll make it get lighter as it moves into the light. What's the problem with that?
Boring?
No, it's
like it's chalky when you get too light.
but it's losing saturation.
It is losing some saturation as you go to light, or the perception of saturation anyway, because we have less color density. But the reason it really looks so cartoony, and that will, if you make a tree out of this range of colors, it's going to look completely like a cartoon.
Okay.
Why?
You've only manipulated one aspect of the color, and it takes all 3 to make light.
Thank you. So what we've done, we've
Smarty
only
pants.
manipulated one aspect of the color, right? We've only changed the value, but we have the same exact chroma and the same saturation level essentially through the whole thing. What we want to be doing is moving from a less saturated to a more saturation, from a cooler to a warmer, at the same time as we go from a middle to a light, right? Because we're always going to observe that, you know, unless maybe you have like a really crazy cool light hitting something. And then you'll adjust for that. But I'll just give you the typical situation where we're moving into a warmer light, right? So as we move into a warmer light, this green, what's going to happen to it? It's going to go more towards
Yellow.
yellow.
A question, just so I understand. With the white is actually a cool. So on a,
White's neutral,
white's neutral.
ideally.
Well,
Now,
So
there's a
it's-
lot of different whites out there.
Uh-huh.
Theoretically, white is neutral. Some of them are going to
Okay.
be warmer, some are going to be cooler. Some people like to use deliberately a warm light or a cool, you know.
Oh, okay.
But I like the idea of a neutral white because when I'm adding white into something, I'm really just trying to control the value of it. I'm not deliberately wanting to change the intensity of it based on that white. Do I want the chroma to shift to something warmer as I add light in? Usually, but I like to be the one in charge of that, right? And if I'm just taking a warm light and using that to do it, I'm not in charge of that anymore. Why am I not in charge of it? Because as it's going lighter, it's going a certain amount warmer. I don't get to decide how much warmer it's going as it's going lighter. It's a problem. So what people have told you at some point in your training, every single person in here has heard this at some point, instead of adding white into your green, what do you add?
Yellow.
Yellow. So this is where most people get left off, and then they're standing out there in the desert after this with no one to help them. They add yellow in, which is a far sight better than adding white in, because now, what are you doing, Chris?
You're manipulating both the saturation and the value.
Two aspects of color instead of just one. So
And
as
hue, too,
as that,
chroma. You're adding chroma
Or-
too.
we're not really manipulating saturation. It's chroma and
Oh, that's-
value,
Yeah,
right?
Chroma and value.
chroma.
So it's getting warmer and it's getting lighter.
Yeah, they're both.
So now we have more of an overall shift going on within this. We still don't have any saturation shift, okay? But at least we have this going on. That is going to be a much nicer tree than this one's going to be, but it's still going to be a little artificial and cartoony because everything's at 100% saturation, okay? So we'd never really use that for a tree in a good painting. We would like to see, some reservation and, room to save that 100% saturation for a highlight or to just not use it, but to keep everything in a more naturalistic kind of range of colors, right? But for the theory part of this, there's something else that I wanted to cover before we start getting into anything gray. So I'm going to leave saturation alone for now, and we'll just talk about how do we manage manipulating this color shift in a way where we're in control of it. Right now, am I in control of, as this lightens up, how much yellower it gets? No, because not if I'm just adding those two tubes of paint. Because as I lighten it, it goes X amount towards yellow, right? And as I go towards yellow, it gets X amount lighter. If I need to get to this color, it's going to be that value. If I need to get to that value, it's going to be that color. So I can't just, go between what came out of the yellow tube and what came out of the green tube. What are the odds that my green thing that I'm painting moves exactly at the same rate that these tubes have assigned, right? That's not the only way to get yellower as we go lighter. It just happens to be what these two tubes are doing, combined with each other. Bad idea. We want to be in control of that, right? So let's say we're observing a green thing, and as it moves into the light, it's getting yellower, but it's not getting yellow as quickly as this does. So in other words, it's getting lighter more than it's getting yellower. So by the time we get to this value, it's still greener than this. It's not this yellow by the time we get to that value. So I need to independently manipulate those two aspects of color. I can't let them just be tied together with what's coming out of the tube. So how do I do that? How do I make this get lighter at a faster rate than it's getting yellower? But I still want it to go yellower as it gets lighter.
By adding white and yellow?
And we've all been doing it, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's been
Yeah.
doing that. It's just, I want this in your head a little more. Okay. So actually we had some right here. This white and yellow. Now if I had that in instead, now I'm independently controlling those two aspects. So now I can say, okay, by the time I get to this value, I want it to be yellower. It is yellower, but I don't want it to be that much yellower. I still want it to stay more over towards the blue side of green, but I don't want it as far over as that. Well, I just mixed these two, right, and lightened it that way to get something in the middle here that's in between there. And according to what I'm mixing here, now, you know, according to how much yellow or how much white, I'm in charge of how much lighter it gets as it gets yellower. I'm in charge of how much yellower it gets as it gets lighter. Right? So that's kind of a simple thing, really, but it's a complex way of looking at a simple thing, which is the way I love to teach, right, really? Simple things and make them ununderstandable.
That's impossible.
I love that.
Okay.
But now actually it's much clearer.
Good.
In the sense that now I know when I'm adding yellow and adding white, I'm adding two different dimensions.
Yeah.
And that I need to think about how much, where I'm trying to go, how light I'm trying to go, but stay on the greener side or the yellower side, you know, so that I...
So I have a trick question for you now.
Yeah.
Now that you guys understand all this,
Okay.
I'm observing a green now that as it gets lighter is getting yellower, but it's not getting light as quickly as it's getting yellow. The opposite of this situation. Now I want it to get yellow faster than it's getting light.
This is where I would put in my transparent.
And that's
Mars
exactly what I would do
yellow.
too. I would take a transparent yellow and add that in. Now, again, if I just take it out of the tube, I'm resigning myself to saying, well, it's getting yellower at the rate it's getting this much lighter, and
Yeah.
I want to be in control of it, right? So I'm going to take, and again, we're staying with 100% saturation for the purposes of this exercise, just to keep it a little simpler. So I'm going to take my lemon yellow, but I'm going to add in this transparent yellow, okay? Now, transparent yellow is not going to affect the value, and maybe I should show you that first. It's not going to affect the value of that green very quickly. It affects the color very quickly, but not the value, right? So we've gone, because of that transparency, it just doesn't have all that white in it, or, you know, those light opaque pigments that lighten something up. It's more like putting a stain on top of that green, and it just doesn't, you know, it doesn't affect the value in a very significant way. So, so now we've moved very quickly from this green over to this much more golden kind of green, right? And very little shift in value. I mean, just tiny, almost imperceptible shift in value as I do that. So that gives me the other option here, and perfect answer, gives you the other option here of as we go darker with, I was going to grab this lemon, or as we go lighter with the green, but we don't want to go that much lighter, I'm going to take a mix of these now into that green so I can control these aspects again. Now this time I wanted to go a little lighter than that, but not as light as something like this. And there we have that. Now, the downside of a transparent yellow is that they're all going to be warm. Okay? So they're not going to be like a spectrum yellow, like a CAD. They're going to be sitting over here almost towards the oranges. And that's just the nature of pigment. However, fortunately for all of us, that's also the nature of nature. You never see a lemon yellow in nature that is dark. It doesn't exist, right? So as your yellows get darker, they're going either warmer or they're going you know, more in towards the oranges, or they're going over towards the blues, or sometimes both at the same time. So both at the same time looks a bit like yellow ochre, right? That's got red in it and it's got blue in it, and it's obviously yellow based. So so that's what happens to yellows as they go darker. They don't stay clean like that. So we don't need a way to be able to keep the yellows clean as we go into a darker yellow. It's not something you'll ever have to reproduce, and therefore, you know, no pigments can be made to do it either. We haven't dealt with saturation at all, okay? But as we're going from this green lighter and yellower, and let's say we're going, we want to go more towards an orange kind of yellow. Well, if we've got green and we put in something that has a little bit of orange to it, like this cad yellow medium, has a little bit of orange to it, are we graying down our green?
A little bit.
Green,
Yeah.
orange. If it
absolutely.
has some orange, it has some
Red.
It
red.
has some red, and
So
red is
you-
the complement of green, and therefore we're graying it down. So as we're moving from shadow to light in this example, what's happening? We're going from 100% saturation to about 90% saturation. Okay, just from that little bit of red, but a tiny bit of red into a very clean green will do a lot. A tiny bit of red into a very neutral green won't do that much, but into a very clean green, a tiny bit does a lot. So the bigger the difference is between two colors you introduce, the more difference that tiny little speck of color can make, right? If you take a total out of the two black, 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 and you add a tiny bit of white into it, you're going to see it. And likewise with, you take white and add a tiny bit of black into it. But if you take, like a 60% gray or 50% gray, something like this, and you add a little bit of black into it, it's going to make a very tiny difference. And that's true of every, not just of every color combination, but every facet of the color combination. So when we're dealing with saturation levels, if we have something that's a very high saturation, we don't need much of the complement to introduce to make a big difference in that paint, which is why even taking something like this to lighten up our green, we're still taking down the saturation levels pretty quickly. It's also why you have to be so careful mixing on a clean palette, mixing with a clean brush. And why, I think a lot of the trouble that people have with mud is just not being clean and organized with stuff. Because when you are reaching for those, anything over 90% saturation, a tiny bit of contamination will make a very noticeable effect on your paint. Okay. So, is there a way to make this brighter in saturation? Brighter, when I say brighter, I'm actually talking about a saturation level, but I like to usually say it two different ways so everybody's clear.
Yeah.
Is there a way to make this brighter
Oh, in saturation.
without changing the other two properties?
Well, what I would use then would be like a warm, only a warm cad yellow. And
So you're putting
no.
anything warm in to a green,
It's not
You're gonna
it's
change
going to
the-
change it. The answer is no. There's not a way.
There's not a way.
There's not a way.
Right.
We've made that as bright as we can possibly make it to be the value it is in the chroma it is, right?
Right. Okay.
So, so how do we make this shift reflect nature more when nature is showing us greater saturation into the light? Go
Bring
ahead.
down the-
We have to bring down the saturation of the gray.
It's the only thing we can do.
Yeah.
Just as if I can't make my red any lighter without it turning pink on me and I need that saturation, I'm going to have to bring down the value of all the colors around it to make that look lit up, right? Same thing's going to be true with all the other aspects of colors. We reach whatever the paint is capable of doing in the, what I call the effect part of the painting, where we're reaching for as far as what the paint can do. Do that early on and then step everything down from that to let that be the most lit, the most, the most saturated, the highest value, whatever kind of stuff that you're trying to reach, or the darkest, or the least saturation, whatever your issue is. You want to, see what the paint can do, and then let that be as close as it can get in the area of the painting that you're reaching for, and step everything down accordingly. So, good. Sometimes I wonder, how long was that sentence?
Doesn't matter.
All right. So, if I want to adjust the value of this, or I want to adjust the saturation of that without adjusting the value, the easiest way to do it is to take another color that's something that has some red in it, like a purple. I could even use a red, but let's take a purple. So it's not quite so direct of a way of getting there, not so simplistic. And mix it to the value of that green. And then just add a little of that in. And now we've stepped down the value of that green, right? That's what it used to be right here. And this can then get brighter as it gets lighter and as it gets warmer. So just as we added yellow into here, I added the complement of the yellow into the shadow of this purple. And now we have this range of greens, but every aspect of this color and this color transformation, this color transition, has been handled deliberately. It's not getting yellower as it gets lighter according to what happens by the tubes. It's not getting darker as it gets purpler according to what happens at the tube, right? It's not getting more saturated as it goes into the shadow, which is what the tube would do. It's getting less saturated at the degree that we wanted to do it. Now, if that's getting less saturated too quickly, what can I do about that?
Too quickly. Well, bring back some of the
Right?
original.
Just do that. Add some green into that purple, and then add this into it, right? So it doesn't have to get desaturated at the rate that that purple decided that was out of the tube. I can just add in some of that green into this, and then add that to make that transition.
So we're in control.
Of all three aspects of color at all times. Okay, let's paint. If there's no questions. All right.
Well done.